Hello, this is Peter Deegan and welcome to the RSSL series of podcasts on my auditing journey. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome Clive Brading. Welcome, Clive.
Welcome, Peter. Thank you.
Perhaps it would be useful if you could give a brief introduction to yourself and your career and particularly your auditing background.
Okay, thank you, Peter. First of all, I've had a varied career in the pharmaceutical industry. I've been lucky to see all sorts of different environments and work for different companies. Some large multinational companies, that's where I finished my career, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit later on. But actually in the early days, I spent nearly 10 years in a small contract manufacturing organisation with a very small quality team, trying to improve and get to a standard to make pharmaceuticals and increase the business as well, which was interesting. I think in all that time, I've had a chance to see and be involved in most types of products, particularly sterile products, but also quite a lot in things like inhalation products, solid dose, liquids, really all the different types of products that we manufacture within the industry. So I've had a varied career, and I really think that's helped to inform me towards the end of that career in terms of my auditing activities, both as an auditor and latterly as the manager of a large audit team for a global multinational.
Well, that's going to be a very interesting interview ahead of us, I think, because we're going to talk about the ISO standard on auditing and the roles and responsibilities. The ISO standard puts a lot of emphasis on managing the audit program, and so we're going to explore that as well. My first question that I always ask Clive is, what was your first audit and what was the experience?
Probably like a lot of people, I remember very clearly the first audit I did. I was very nervous about it. It was a time when I was working for that small CMO, contract manufacturing for a large multinational client, and they requested that we do an audit of one of the suppliers of the packaging materials. Happened to be in Spain. I'd, at that stage, not travelled much for business. I'd never done auditing before. No one had ever taught me what to do. So I did the best preparation I could at the time. This was a few years ago. There was no internet that I could look up. I could Google things. So I did what you had to do then, which was go to the library, try and find books on auditing. Found what I was looking at in terms of a book which talked around pharmaceutical auditing. Unfortunately, it was a book that was very reliant on a checklist approach. So I thought, oh, this must be the way that you do audits. So I prepared my checklist. I travelled to Spain with the client. We did the audit. I got back, and when I looked at what I'd actually achieved in the audit in the time that we were on site, we weren't there long, it was a one-day audit, I really hadn't taken much note of what was going on. I didn't have much to write up. We hadn't really made any observations. And when I look back at it, I really didn't do an audit at all. I think I would say it was more like a technical visit than an audit. And I'm sure the supplier must have wondered what we were doing in the end. So I was with, from the client side, someone who was supposedly an experienced auditor. But thinking back, I'm not sure that there was much guidance from that side at all. So having finished that first experience, I realised I really didn't know how to audit.
What was your biggest learn from that first ever audit that you did?
I think it was starting to understand that you need to prepare better. I thought I'd prepared reasonably, but when I look back and I reflected on it, I realised I hadn't really prepared. I hadn't done any background on the company we were visiting as I would do today if I was doing that kind of audit. I'd be asking questions, I'd be getting information, I'd be requesting documents to look at in advance, really to maximise the time that you have. And that was the other factor for me, and it's often a real limiter, is when you're doing audits, you only have a very limited time. If you're doing supplier audits, typically you're lucky if you can get 2 days on site, even for very complex operations. And 2 days to look at, understand, and identify potential issues, and good practice as well, in that kind of operation, you really need to plan in advance, and you really need to do what you can in advance. And I think that was the biggest learning for me.
So let's wind forward to now you're head of an audit team. At our SSL, all our training programs are based on ISO 19011, the auditing guidance for quality management systems. In that guidance, they put a lot of emphasis on the audit program, setting an audit program. And an audit program is defined as an arrangement for a set of one or more audits planned for a specific time frame and directed towards a specific purpose. And in the early stages of our training courses, we get the delegates to pull an audit program together or tell us what their audit program is for the last year. And it's often a not interconnected series of random, almost like a dartboard effect, where we've just said, well, we'll do this audit, that audit, that audit. No joined up thinking. What's your experience of having had responsibility for setting an annual audit program, an internal first-party audit self-inspection program, a second-party supplier audit program? How did you approach that? What can we learn from what you've done?
I think the first thing when you're looking at any audit program is just to think about risk. Now, for many years, risk and risk management has been a real key phrase for the industry. And I think this is one of those areas where you really need to use risk. Even when I was first put in charge of the audit team that I had, and this was an audit team of approximately 50 experienced auditors, the aim for that audit team was to do the quality system audits of not just manufacturing sites, but also distribution centres and also commercial offices and research and development. So it was a wide brief covering the whole of the company internally. And when you look at that, even with 50 auditors, you can't cover all of those things all of the time in a significant depth. Just didn't have the resource to do that. So what you need to do is to have some methodology which allows you to say, yeah, here's where we're going to spend our time. Here's how we allocate the resources, hopefully to get the best return on investment, because it is a big investment to run an audit team like that. I remember even looking at just the travel budget, we were looking in terms of millions of euros a year. And then on top of that, the salaries for all those people and all the rest. So it's a significant investment for any company to run that kind of audit program and audit team. And you need to use that resource wisely. So when I took the team over, the approach we had was fairly classical. It was risk-based. It looked at what type of entity are we auditing, or what type of entity do we have generally. And then it fixed through global procedures how long we spend auditing each type of entity. So fairly typical. Is this a sterile site? We'll spend more time there. Is this a site manufacturing, maybe solid dose? Maybe we spend a bit less time. Is this a commercial office and with just sales and marketing activities? And we spend less time on that kind of activity. And that was all specified and proceduralized. What was interesting when I took over was one of the first things we decided was that we never had the answer to the question about who audits the auditors. So we had an audit team. It was auditing all the time. And oftentimes the people we were auditing would say, yeah, but who's auditing what you do? And the decision we took was to say, what kind of standards could we apply? How could we answer that question? And the answer came in the form of an ISO standard as well. There's an ISO standard 17020. We were aware through the industry that at least one regulatory authority had actually used that standard and were accredited to it, and that really interested us. So we started off down the ISO road, and we learnt a lot when we went through that, but particularly starting with the audit program, we kind of realized that just having a procedure specifying numbers of years between audits was not necessarily the best way to actually structure the audit program. So what we did was look to say, well, how can we structure the program, taking into account that notion of risk, not just risk in terms of what type of products or activities are going on, but what's the performance data? Remember, this was a large multinational company, and in probably common with most types of multinational companies, we measured everything to death. There were metrics everywhere at every level within the organisation, probably too many to manage the business effectively, or at least some of them probably we collected just to look at and not do much with. But there was quite a lot of data around how were the various activities performing from a quality standpoint. And so when we were looking at the audit program, what we could do was mine some of that data as well. Do we need to go every year, every 2 years? Could we actually look at changing the frequencies and focusing the resources we had more effectively? And that was something that really came out of looking at the ISO standard, but also applying a little bit of common sense to the situation.
So on that sliding scale of risk, internal audits are pretty low risk, aren't they, really? And we can get away with just saying, well, we'll audit each department over a 12-month period. We'll do a couple of days and just check things are okay. Because first-party audits, self-inspections, Chapter 9 has only got a very short section. It's 1 page. Not as important as the other stuff, are they?
I actually saw it exactly the other way around. And probably a lot of the debates and discussions that we had when we were doing the audits was looking at the outcomes and actually asking the question, why has this particular site or entity not picked up the issues that we're finding? Because we're going in cold, we don't have the same day-to-day exposure, and we're seeing things which we felt should be picked up by the self-inspection program. I think you're right. The situation I saw, and I had a lot of experience working with various sites on this, was that self-inspection was seen sometimes as a bit of a tick box exercise. Yeah, we have to have a self-inspection program. It's in Chapter 9. We need to do something about it. As you said, we'll have this way of doing, okay, we'll do each area once a year. We'll tick the box, that's fine. One of the first things I said to the audit team when I took over was that doing audits is not the value added thing for the company. The audit itself is not the value added. What adds value is a combination of the audit and then actually following up with the proper corrective and preventive actions afterwards and making sure that they get put in place so that you don't actually repeat the same issue again. I said that's the equation for me that's value added. So I think it's the same for the self-inspections. If you approach with more of a tick box mentality, you'll do the audit, you'll think, that's done. You'll issue some kind of audit report, and then the next time you go, you find, well, actually, no, we didn't quite complete that preventive action, and the same situation will still exist. So that was the issue that I had a lot, and I discussed a lot with sites and with those that were responsible for quality, not just at site level, but at corporate level.
In GMP, we've got Part 1, basic approach to GMP requirements, which is the factory floor stuff, and we really focus on that a lot. We've got APIs Part 2, and we've got the annexes and site master file. But within Part 3, you've got a relatively new guidance called ICHQ10. And the history behind that is from ISO 9001. Nowhere in the Part 1 does it talk about management commitment, continuous improvement. We've now got Chapter 1, which embellishes that. But what you're saying is that internal audit should cover ICHQ10 requirements of management commitment. Is this company embracing knowledge management? Is it continually improving? Is its corrective and preventive actions working, and are they effective?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think latterly, in the time that I've been doing independent consulting, when I've been asked to go and audit or assess a facility, one of the first things I look at is exactly that issue. What's the level of management review? How's management review carried out? And how does that then relate to the pharmaceutical quality system? Because that's what ICHQ10 is all about. It's talking around having a set of coherent things in place with that management overview, rather than waiting for an audit team or even at some stages a regulatory inspector to come and tell you what's wrong in your own facility. That's the important thing for me. And I think it's really interesting when I go to facilities where I see a good level of that management review, I almost know as I start to walk around the facility that the overall level of the quality system is going to be good, because the management involvement in that sends a strong message also down to the shop floor that this stuff matters. And when the shop floor gets that kind of message, and all the organisation gets that kind of message, you know that, yeah, there are going to be issues, there always are, but those issues are going to be surfaced, they're going to be looked at properly, and they're going to be treated. And you really can't ask much more than that of your quality system.
So we're in a small laboratory, analytical laboratory, and we're looking at our annual program, and calibration of the equipment is really important. We'll put that on our self-inspection program. Reagent labeling, we'll put that on our self-inspection program. We'll training and competence of the analysts on the various machinery, we'll do that. How am I going to incorporate senior management level commitment in my small laboratory audit then? There seems to be a large gap of understanding of ICHQ10 is just review and interviews with the senior management team.
I think for me, although I said earlier that you can overdo the metrics thing, every area of your organisation should have in place some sensitive measurements, some sensitive metrics, key performance indicators, call them what you like. Even within a laboratory, typically I would expect to be looking at things like what's the level of out of specification reporting, out of trend reporting. More importantly, not just what's the level, but when those are investigated, how much of that is actually to do with analyst issues, which can indicate training problems? How much is it to methods, maybe, which could indicate poor method development, or even the fact that the methods are old, they've not been updated, which is a requirement. So those sort of metrics should be in place, and those are the kind of metrics I would expect then to be surfaced up, to be escalated up to the management level, and to be looked at in the round, not just the laboratory, but in all areas, to actually form that picture of what's the quality system doing, how's it performing, and using metrics that are sensitive enough that they start to tell a story. You don't want metrics that tell you you're in difficulty when you're actually already there. You want something that's a little bit more sensitive than that. And for those kind of metrics, typically the time-bound ones are the most telling. So the ones in terms of, say, stability program, is it on time? When we're talking in the laboratory, that's a key one, for example. But also in other areas, when you're looking at deviation management, a deviation is closed on time, are corrective and preventive actions done on time, is the audit program itself done on time? Those kind of timely ones can actually start to give you a picture overall of the level of control at a site level, but also then a level of management involvement. How involved is the management? Are they seeing that kind of data? Are they reacting to it?
So coming back to the audit program, you've done a risk-based approach. I'm very interested to understand your experiences. You had a large audit team of 50, which is, it's an incredibly large team, and yet you still say you couldn't cover everything.
Yeah, that's correct. And as the head of an audit team, one of the things you come to expect is every time there's a regulatory inspection on one of those facilities, even if the inspection went well, quite often I'd be waiting for my phone to ring and for the question to be asked, did your team see X, Y, and Z, whatever had come up within there? And I always had to say the same thing. We go, we do the best job we can, we do it on a risk base, but we're taking the picture, it's not the movie. It's a picture of what we saw at the time. We make it clear in the reports that that's the case, as in fact do the regulatory inspectors. They always put that kind of caveat in the reports, that this is just a picture at a particular point in time. Now, hopefully, if we've done our job right, whilst we won't have found everything, we will have found the things which present most risk to the quality system, but at the end of the day, of course, risk to the patient. And that's what's important to us.
What I say to delegates on our courses when we talk about the audit program and this snapshot in time is that the role of the auditor is, I like what you said there, you're taking a picture, not a film, and that there is an overall life cycle procurement process. But it's a continuous dialogue on a day-to-day basis. You're working collaboratively with companies, and so an audit can't give you the holistic overview of the whole procurement, management, life cycle relationship process. It's just a sample.
Yeah, that's correct. And probably one of the biggest challenges for me as a head of an audit team was there was always that requirement to summarize what's the audit telling us in a meaningful way. The trouble is, sometimes that got to a level where it was maybe a bit trite. We were trying to say, okay, this is the picture of audits. We looked at the classic way of doing that with some kind of traffic light system to show, where are the potential issues within the broad number of sites that we looked at. But it's actually quite difficult because you want to find a way that is actually sensitive enough that it will tell you, yeah, we have more risk in this area than this area. What we found is that to do that, if you look at too many variables, when you go to any site, some things are done well, some things are done not so well. Overall, if you look at too many things, they just all cancel each other out, and you get to the point of doing, as we did at one point, massive spreadsheets, all sorts of data in it, and in the end, not telling you much more than probably common sense would have told you looking at the sites. So I think it was always a difficult one to actually say, well, what's the outcome? And I fully agree. The outcome is not just what happened in one particular audit or inspection. It's what happens in the round in terms of that. If it's a supplier, it's how you manage the relationship with that supplier outside of just the audits. In everything else, how do you follow up issues on delivery of materials if you have them? Do you have regular meetings with the supplier to discuss continuous improvement, not just reacting to things that have happened? So supplier one, that's quite an easy thing to look at. It's probably a bit more difficult when you're looking internally within an organization to say, well, okay, how do we leverage the information we're getting from audits, but what other stuff do we put together? I think what's driving the industry now, interestingly, is a lot is coming actually from the other side of the Atlantic. The FDA are very hot at the moment on this whole notion of quality management maturity, and how do you measure maturity in, for example, a manufacturing site or an organization. And I think that's quite interesting. It's been picked up. There are different models that are floating around on maturity of quality management systems. So, there's a ISPI and PDA, etc., have all produced different types of models. And I think in the end, that approach, along with ICH-Q10, is probably the way to go to effectively look at integrating together what your audits are telling you, but with everything else which goes around managing quality systems at a site level.
I once read an business article, that said 85% of the CEOs in the world are from an accounting background. And in the pharmaceutical industry particularly, we are becoming smaller entities with a exciting molecule that wants to get a license. And so the organization is small. QA could be just one person, and the QA manager, the QA head, and the audit team in one, and they've got to do a much more broad series of audits, which sometimes may take them outside their skill set. In terms of that role, then, trying to convince a managing director or a head of business who is looking at the financial balance sheet more, because that's their role, to grow the business and ensure that the business is successful and meet better patient needs in the pharmaceutical industry, as we say. Auditing is not on the core value chain. What's the value proposition to you putting your audit program? Let's say you're a small audit team rather than your head of corporate audit, where it's more easy, even though challenging. How do you convince them to say, I've got to do 12 supplier audits this year, and this is the travel budget, and I need some auditors. We haven't got enough. We might have to actually outsource the auditing for a third party audits. How do I communicate the value proposition of auditing to somebody who is not experienced in auditing and just sees it as a sunk cost?
I think the starting point for me is to talk around risk to business, because at the end of the day, any investment that you make in auditing is an investment to help you understand one tool, but amongst others, but it's to help you understand what's the risk to your business and also to manage that risk and improve the risk profile if that's the case. So when you're looking at supplier audit, you're looking at not how much is it going to cost to send an auditor there, but what's our spend with that supplier? And more importantly, if that supplier fails, what's the impact on our business? And the interesting thing is, and this is known by the authorities as well, when they look at suppliers and how we manage suppliers within the industry, they recognise that the actual cost of supplied materials usually is quite low in relation to the eventual selling cost of the product. But the impact in terms of your business, if a supplier fails, is not able to deliver at the quality level that you require, or worse still, impacts your business to a level where you're having to look at potentially recalling product. Impact to the business in terms of loss of sales, loss of integrity, public image, that's massive. And out of all proportion, really, probably to what the spend with a supplier was in the first place. So I think it's a discussion around risk management and risk to business and what would happen potentially if you don't do that supply. You can use an argument that says, yeah, this is around, well, we have to do it because it's GMP compliance. It's a requirement, and which is true. But in a way, when you're talking to that level of person within the business and the background that you've talked around, that's really the last argument you want to use. You want to use more coherent business arguments first. Okay, at the end you have to say, by the way, this is something that we are required to do, but here's all the other reasons why it's a good thing to do. It's an investment, not a cost.
I was going to ask that very question, that it's a regulatory requirement is the first bullet on the slide presentation, and it should be the last bullet. The first line on the bullet should be, our patient safety, efficacy and quality is the business that we're in, and there are methods and requirements to be achieved to do that. And if you put it in that continuous improvement, risk reduction, quality culture, and it's that feedback to management about the pulse of the organisation, where is the business risk? Again, a lot of other examples I've used is that well, the regulatory inspection agencies require it to be done as well, and it's almost like seen as a hammer, really. Well, yes, that's what their job is, but that's not the core driver. And yes, the agencies will look at Chapter 9 and they will ask, but what's your internal audit programme? What's your audit programme? Are you achieving it? They're asking it for a reason, though.
Yeah, that's correct. And certainly for me, looking at the audit programme and coming back to that investment idea, you have got to show that there's a value add. And that comes back to the remark I made earlier, which for me was the value add in any audit is not doing the audit, it's doing the audit and then following up on what you find.
Yeah.
Because that in the end will add value to the business, even if it's a cost avoidance of something worse happening in the future. Cost avoidance adds value to the business.
Somebody once said to me, the true value is only realised when the loss adjuster comes in, but that's too late.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. And I still at times, working in a number of different environments, heard the comment that said, yeah, but our regulatory inspections are good. What's the problem? We know this site has a good history with the regulatory authorities. But you talk to any quality guy working on a site or that's worked in corporate, and they know you're only one inspection away from failure always. Because for the same reason, the regulatory authorities take a picture. The picture they took last time may have been relatively good of the site. The next time they come and take a different picture in a different area. And then maybe they see something they really don't like, and then you have all sorts of problems you don't want to have. So I think that notion of, yeah, we're doing all right on our regulatory inspections, that's a really dangerous area if you're relying on that alone to tell you whether your business is working or not.
There's a really great book which I highly recommend called Bounce by Matthew Sayed, and it's about performance improvement through sporting examples. He was a UK table tennis champion. He quoted an interview of an athlete at the Olympics who just won gold that afternoon. Let's say it was a track and field event. And they said, what are you going to do tomorrow? And they said, well, I've just won the gold medal, but I'll be up at 6 a.m. tomorrow doing my training as usual for the next World Championship. And it's a matter of, just because I've got a good inspection doesn't mean to say then I relax. But you've got a good inspection because that level of quality that you're consistently maintaining every day. If you win the gold medal, if you get a good audit, then you have to be up doing the same thing, which will achieve the next gold medal for the next audit or inspection. I think that's really important to not rest on your laurels, but that's what it takes to keep being good.
I think the other key thing when we start to look at audits, we've talked around the planning of audits, the program. There's something also in the way that audits are actually performed, and that was another area that I worked a lot with the audit team that I managed. Because at the end of the day, auditing is also a very human activity. You've got the auditor and the auditee, both sides of the table. They've got different roles to perform. There's pressure on both sides. There's pressure on the auditee because they obviously want a good outcome. They've probably got their management behind them looking at it. And the same for the auditor. The auditor is always under pressure. They're under time pressure because they're trying to do a lot in a short time. There's always a concern for an auditor. Am I walking past a major issue that I should be seeing? It's a very human activity. And certainly one of the things that I always emphasised with my audit team was, remember that and have some empathy for the auditee. You're there to create a relationship. You obviously want to be as effective as you can within the limited time you have. But at the end of the day, to get a value-added outcome, you really need to make sure that the auditee is properly involved, they understand, and at the end, if there are things that need to be corrected, they understand what are those things and why. Not just reading the report, but understanding from the auditor themselves and the way the audit's been conducted that, there is an issue and I need to do something about it. But, remember, none of us likes to be audited. It was probably the biggest learning when we went for the ISO 17020 accreditation, was that suddenly a team of auditors were being audited themselves. And none of us like that. And we went through exactly the same sort of pain that every auditee goes through. There were times when we didn't agree with the auditor and we felt very aggrieved that they took a different view to us on things. So we went through all of that kind of pain too. I actually think that's quite good for an audit team from time to time to experience that. But, at the end of the day, if you're auditing something, remember it's a person across from you. They might work in the same company that you do. There might be someone that works in a supplier company to you, but they're trying to do the best job that they can do. Your job is there to help them. It may be help they don't want, but your job is there to really help them. And I think it's also important with that in mind, and some people feel sometimes maybe that's a bit trite, but you must actually say what's good in an audit. And the audit report shouldn't just be around this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. It should identify where things are compliant, and more importantly, where there are things which are done well. Because my experience, most sites have things that they can improve on, but some things that they actually do really well. And that should be captured in the audit report as well. It should be communicated to the auditee during the audit and obviously through the audit report.
I have learned a lot being a tutor on an IRCA certified lead auditor course personally. And what I have gained most of all is the words that ISO use as regards to introducing yourself at the opening meeting almost. My role here is to assess conformance. Not my role here is to find the deficiencies. If there are deficiencies, okay, then we will have to look at them. And this wording deficiencies. We do a lot of role play in our audit courses, and they start the beginning of the course, and they use their however I have concerns, and we put a lot of emphasis on retraining their thinking to say ISO look for conformance. That's their role. So the analogy I always use is a house on stilts. Okay, my role is to assess the robustness of the stilts holding up the house. And you go, pillar number 1 is okay, pillar number 2 is okay, pillar number 3 is okay, pillar number 4 has got a crack in it. So we need a corrective action to bring it back into conformance so that holistically it's providing an holistic support. Even agencies only list deficiencies sometimes.
Yeah.
And also, as well, we talk about the narrative in the audit report. If I'm reading the audit report 2 years hence, or if I'm a qualified person needing to know what was the outcome of that supplier audit as regard quality for patient safety, efficacy, and quality, does that narrative tell me where conformance was? So it's important in that narrative to be able to accredit where conformance was being observed. It is a sample. You can't have a 50-page audit report. I saw this. The audit objectives are to assess conformance of scope X of this audit. Therefore, the outcome and the closing meeting are, have my audit objectives been met in my ability to assess conformance?
I think what acts against that approach, and certainly within our industry, is that sometimes there's a concern at the auditor level that if they say something is good or conforms, and then later there's some kind of observation, particularly in a regulatory inspection, they feel it's going to call back to them to say, well, you looked at this and you said it was okay, and now regulator authority X is saying it's not, and there's a problem. And there's a kind of concern that, okay, it's easy to say, okay, this is not right. I think it takes a little bit more courage and guts maybe to actually look at something and say, actually, I think that actually conforms. It's okay. With the proviso of you've only looked at it, it's a snapshot that you've looked at, and your snapshot says it looks okay. So I try to tell my auditors, don't be afraid to say something is okay. Because I'm not going to come back later on and say, oh, you looked at that and said it was okay and it wasn't. As long as they've looked objectively at evidence and they said, yeah, I said it was okay because I looked at X, Y, and Z and that all looked fine. And maybe they did miss something that's somewhere else, but at least they've given an honest appraisal of what they looked at. And if that appraisal at the time said, my picture says things look all right, then I'll accept that.
There are a couple of things which I think helps us in using the ISO model. Number one is that objective evidence is defined as the truth or verity of something, so it's facts. And the other element is what is the audit criteria, what are the requirements? The requirements are, and it could be in your SOP, it could be in the regulations. One of the examples we use is that the SOP says people should be wearing blue gloves. They were wearing white gloves. The auditee said, well, yeah, but they were still wearing gloves. Well, the requirement was blue. It's a non-conformance that you're wearing white. You can't argue against fact, and I think that helps you in that conformance assessment rather than an opinion. You can't give free consultancy. You can't give an opinion. The requirements were this. I found that. That is therefore conforming to the requirements. It's really hard, and this is one of the most frequent questions we get on our audit course is, can I give advice? Can I help them? Can I offer them some ways forward? ISO is very clear. No, you're there to assess conformance and not. And there's a fine balance. What's your opinion on that?
I think it depends a little bit what's the context of the audit which is being carried out. When I was looking after that audit team, we were auditing internally, so we're auditing sites and organisations and operations which were part of the same company. And I actually said to the auditors, I didn't mind if they discussed and used a little bit of their knowledge to help the auditee if an issue was found. It didn't change the reporting, so it would still be reported as a non-conformance. But if the auditor was aware of, from their experience, approaches or a way to look at something which they've seen work effectively on another site, sharing some of that knowledge sometimes is useful, because remember what I said earlier, what interested me wasn't just here's the audit report and here are the non-conformances. It was also, here's the actions we're taking to actually address the issue that we found. And if we can help the auditee that way. But it is a fine balance, because at the end of the day, you are there to audit. You're not there as a consultant to help to fix issues that are in place. And obviously, as a head of audit, I don't want also my audit team to be spending time giving free consultancy and not doing the audit that they're being paid to do. So I think there's a little bit of a balance in there. But I didn't really have too much of a problem with the auditors using some of their experience and background. I think to flip to the other side, based on what you said, one of the things which we had absolutely clear in our audit system was if there was any observation made of a non-conformance, that had to be alongside a clear indication, whether that came either from regulation or from internal procedure, exactly what the non-conformance was. Where were we citing as the non-conformance? Because then you do avoid that tendency you could have for the auditor saying, well, I'm giving you a non-conformance because I don't like the way you do it.
Yes.
So I think we saw that was important. You needed to be able to say, yep, here's the non-conformance. By the way, here's the reference. When we were doing internal audits, a lot of those references were against global standards, global requirements, which themselves were a reflection, obviously, of regulatory requirements.
The way that we teach people in our auditing courses in the classification and the writing of audit findings essentially is, this is a snapshot. My professional judgment here, based upon the requirements, based upon the correct criteria, is X. It is likely to be a major observation. However, the process we have back at base is that I will write my audit report, it will have peer review, just to make sure that my judgment is concurrent with the organisation and my audit client's judgment. We do that. I think that's really important. How do you classify audit findings, and how do you communicate those at the closing meeting, for example? Because it can be quite emotive and quite alarming if you're saying that's going to be a critical audit finding without that ability to do that assessment and just making sure that it is, and you've got the absolute unequivocal evidence to be able to justify that and stand by it.
I think there are two things that are involved in that. And the first is a decent auditor, when they get to the closing meeting, is never going to present something which is a shock to the auditee. So if they've been finding issues, this is not an exercise to show, oh, how clever I am as an auditor, and like a magician in the closing meeting, I'm going to whip the cover off and show you all of these things which I found are wrong. If we find auditors doing that, they're not doing a proper audit job. What they should be doing during the audit is immediately they find something which they have a concern about, is they should be sharing that with the auditee. It's only fair. It gives the auditee time to look at the issue, to present maybe further data and information that the auditor wasn't aware of, which actually would mitigate. Give the auditee time to present extra data, extra information that maybe the auditor hasn't seen and maybe will mitigate to some extent or totally the concern that the auditor has. So it's really important that during the audit there's an open communication between the auditor and the auditee, and particularly from the auditor in terms of issues that they may have. Then when you get to the closing meeting, totally agree with you, and that was the system that we managed as well. We always said that any findings we presented in the closing meeting should be considered as a draft, and that there was a peer review afterwards to make sure that the concern that the auditor was expressing, one, was correct. It was actually supported by a proper reference, global requirement, a regulatory requirement, and so forth, and that they correctly assessed the likely impact of that non-conformance. However, even with that proviso in the closing meeting, sometimes it could still be emotional to present and difficult for the auditor. Probably the most difficult was those times when the audit had been well managed, often by the site quality team, but in the closing meeting, maybe the site manager, the site director would turn up, who'd not been involved, not had the discussions, would sit down, would see the first slide come up and say, we have this particular concern, whether it's critical or major or minor, and would start to almost want to redo the audit in the closing meeting. So we gave a lot of training to our auditors in how to react in those situations, even to the point of stopping the closing meeting and saying to a person if they were being particularly disruptive in that way. Listen, we did the audit. These are the outcomes we found. Your managing team are aware of these. I understand you have concerns about it. I'm here. I'm going to present this. We will review it afterwards. But at this particular stage, we don't have time to repeat the audit. You need to discuss this with your team internally. And one or two times, the auditors did have to manage that kind of situation. It's not an easy situation to be in.
You've just described our Urca Lead Auditor course closing meeting example. We put a lot of participative learning in our courses for that very reason. We do a lot of role play. We play the belligerent auditee or the very technically knowledgeable auditee who knows their environment more than the auditor and is really pushing away, and see how the auditor reacts, because it's a safe learning environment in our training courses. They can get to practice and get feedback and practice again and get feedback so that they feel confident. One of the biggest set of feedback we get from individuals wanting to come on our course is the only way to learn how to audit is to audit, and that's quite scary. So we push their buttons to see how they react so that they've got some self-reflective learning as well. I think that's absolutely incredibly important.
Yeah, I definitely doing an audit, preparing for an audit, all of that kind of stuff. For me personally, that's the easier end of the business. Doing the audit is difficult, but presenting in the closing meeting, particularly if things have not gone well in the audit, that's probably the biggest challenge that an auditor will ever have.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Now, if they prepared the ground well, they've communicated well during the audit, the hope is that will make that experience slightly more pleasant for them and for the auditee and themselves, but it's not always the case. And as I said, there can be times when people who've not been involved in the audit turn up at the closing meeting, and then it can become quite difficult. Yeah.
My final question, Clive, is, so we've gone through the audit cycle, we've set the audit programme, we've done the audit, we've looked at competence assessment, we've looked at presenting the audit findings. So you've published the audit report, and the auditee has 30 days to respond, and then you hear nothing from them for 3 or 4 months. What advice can you give to people on how best to follow up audit findings to ensure closure, and what is audit closure in your definition?
That's a good question. I think the first thing is to think about who was it you audited and who is it that's not responding. Clearly, if that's a third party, if it's a supplier, hopefully through your audit team, you have a good relationship, for example, with your procurement department, who may deal with that supplier more regularly than you are. So you should be going to them to say, look, I've got this problem. We've done the audit. We did the report. We've had absolutely no return from the auditor. So get the people that are responsible involved from that viewpoint, which could be whatever you call it, procurement, purchasing, supply chain. It comes under a number of different titles. I think if it's internal audits at another site, it's actually the same thing. Who are the people who are managerially responsible for that, to go to them? In a way, my experience was it was always easier to get a response internally than it was sometimes to get a response from suppliers. So internally, I can't really remember too many times where we had to go back to a site to say, you haven't responded, because the management systems were such that they were actually measured around those things. And we would also report internally, not just the audits we've done and the outcomes, but also the follow-up activities. So has the CAPAs or the particular preventive actions, have they been put in place? Have we had a response? All those sorts of things were in the metrics we looked at. And that would be reflected, and the management of the sites would look at it. So I think your real challenge is when you're looking at third parties, particularly if that third party didn't want the audit, and particularly if your business, as they would see it, it's not critical to them. You may be a small part of their business, and they're looking at all the effort that you're requiring, not just to do the audit report, but actually to do the audit response, but also, and critically, to put in place the actions that are required for that response. So I think that's my advice, such as it is leverage those around you within your organization. You'll obviously follow up directly with your contact at the third party to say, look, we haven't heard anything, what's happening? But leverage those that are responsible within your own organisation to help you on that. Don't try and do it just you.
Very interestingly, the ISO guidance and the IRCA training course, particularly at lead auditor level, says that the auditor has to go back to the audit client. The audit client is defined as the person or organisation commissioning the audit, because the audit client needs to go. The auditor, their job was to audit. Their job is not to invoke management requirements or, as you say, supply chain procurement policies. That's their job. You've done the audit. You are a technical advisor and a participator in that, but you're not accountable. The audit client's got to fight that battle in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think that's the way I would see it as well. The auditor's there to do a particular job, but not to manage the supply.
So we've got a finding that say, and the response is, yes, we understand the severity of that. We'll build a new facility and it's going to take 4 years. How do you close that? How do you close an audit off with long-term or large finding resolutions?
That can also be a really tricky one in terms of looking at timescales when you're reviewing the responses from your auditee. I think if the response comes back with a long time frame, so let's say 12, 24, 36 months to put in place a particular preventive action, my first question would be beyond that, okay, that's fine, that addresses the issue I saw maybe in 2 years' time, but what are the mitigation that you're going to put in place now to address the issue that we've seen? Because you're not stopping manufacture if it's a manufacturing operation. You're not stopping manufacture for 2 years while you build a new facility. So what mitigation are you going to put in place in the short term? I think then if you get that mitigation and the mitigation looks reasonable, you have a decision to make to say, well, do I trust that? Can I wait until the next time I'm planning to go and audit that facility? Or in fact, do I need some confidence in advance of that, either through the auditee sending information and updates at a regular interval, or providing proof of actions taken, or even going to do a follow-up audit sooner than planned? You're starting to think about those kind of things when you're dealing with that kind of activity. I would say I've seen it from time to time where the supplier or the auditee uses that kind of approach almost to kick the issue into the long grass. And that's what you've got to be aware of. And the question should also always be, okay, that may be an appropriate action in 2-3 years' time, but what's happening today? You're still making stuff. What's happening today?
That's great, thank you. That's very much how I think, and it's very difficult to know when the audit report is signed off and closed, and it is that life cycle approach and continuity. But I love the way you've sort of granulated that. What's happening today?
Yeah.
I really like that. Clive, as I say to most of my interviewees, we could probably talk for another half a day on this. It's a fascinating area. Thank you very much for your insight. Thank you very much for your openness and honesty and your advice. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Peter.